Right, good evening, comrade. So, where to start, really? 65,000 deaths, depending on which figures you want to take, I suppose, in the UK. One of the worst records globally from the UK in terms of the coronavirus, the COVID-19 pandemic. Chaos across the capitalist world, and perhaps that will come out in discussion as to why I've highlighted the capitalist world, because I've been one to follow China's progress with this very closely, and other socialist countries, with a couple of exceptions across the capitalist world, I would say. Most countries appear to be dealing with this in an extremely bad way. That is, unless you ask the question, what is the objective of governments in terms of dealing with a pandemic? Because on that level, if we have that sort of type of discussion tonight, you might suggest that the Tories' strategy is highly effective. But I'll let that discussion come out in due course. So, an economic depression surely to follow, and well, we know who's going to be asked to pay for that. And so we thought it was important to have a meeting on the issue of COVID-19 from the only daily paper of the left, the only English-speaking daily paper of the left in the world. My name's Jim Reekey. I'm the chair of the Morning Star group here in Shropshire. We've held a number of successful meetings over the years that we've been functioning as a Morning Star group here. And this will be our first one on Zoom, and hopefully the first of many, but there's nothing like being in person with people. It's not quite the same, is it? Our main speaker tonight is Oliver Dodd. He's the organizer of the successful COVID-19 Fight Back Facebook page. He's also a political economy PhD student, which takes him to Columbia from time to time, I believe. And he'll do the lead off. I think he's suggested for about 20 minutes. And then afterwards, I think we should have some questions, discussion, and, maybe start sketching out the future after this or during this, whether we think it's going to be going away anytime soon. Again, that will come up in discussion, I'm sure. But, in terms of coordinating and organising the fight back against the inevitable the fallout from this pandemic and health crisis. So, without further ado, I'll hand over to Oliver Dodd. Thank you, comrades.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to do this discussion. A special thanks to Jim and Andy and the Shropshire Morning Star supporters group. It's a really important issue to be discussing, and I hope we can all draw up on our own experiences during this crisis. We're all here to learn from each other, and perhaps the Q&A at the end can be an opportunity to do that. In this discussion, really, what I'm going to go through, I'm just going to go through I'm going to look at how the virus itself was facilitated by capitalism over the long term, and then I'm going to go over more the immediate issues relating to the virus. But it highlights how the coronavirus situation is very much a political and economic issue. It's a health crisis. I don't like to call it the coronavirus crisis, because that seems to detach it from broader class related realities that are going on. So without further ado, I'm just going to talk about how it was historically constructed over the long term, because I think this is a point that needs to be made. It's a point that's not made enough, and I think that's to do with the lack of planning. Capitalism is obviously focused on the short term, when the economy is in the hands of an extremely small number of people, each of who are always pursuing short-term profits. They're only thinking about profits. They're not thinking about human needs or health or such things. They're always trying to focus on the short term. And this doesn't allow us really to prioritize for such a crisis as this, either for a pandemic or just general health issues in society. And I think we see this with the growth of the pharmaceutical industry, always trying to find the highest bidder for each piece of medicine. And it puts us in a real danger when we come to a situation like the coronavirus. As we've seen at the moment, pharmaceutical companies they're striving very hard to be the one who finally gets to create the first vaccine for this virus, so they can make a fortune. And I don't think this is a very good situation to be in. And we've seen the privatisation of the NHS over the years, not just under the Conservative government, but also under a very right-wing Labour government. The continued privatisation of the NHS from within, salami tactics, privatising it slice by slice in order to avoid the kind of controversy that would erupt if it was just wholesale privatised all of a sudden. So they're using all kinds of Machiavellian tactics, and this has left us in a very difficult situation when it comes to a health crisis. It's not only facilitated the spread of the coronavirus, it's actually led to the deaths of too many people, and it's an absolute tragedy. So that's one of the ways that this virus has been historically constructed, about understanding it as a political crisis and not simply as the spread of a virus that we call COVID-19. Another way that it's the crisis has been facilitated is the destruction of our manufacturing industry and the prioritising by the respective governments over the years of the finance sector, the City of London, exporting capital abroad, privileging the City of London over trying to produce real commodities that can be, that allow us to plan, focus on basic needs like schooling, education and healthcare. So when it comes to a situation where we need PPE, we didn't have enough PPE and we still don't have enough PPE. We're left to beg to other countries that do have PPE and we have to buy it off them. And as a result of the destruction of our manufacturing industry over the years, as a result of neoliberalism, this has actually facilitated the crisis. People say, oh, this is many years ago, but it's absolutely related, because if we had a planned manufacturing industry, we could be restructuring industry right now to deal with any kind of health crisis. But because of what industry is left and isn't left in the hands of privateers, then it's very difficult to do that. So in terms of the whole historical construction of this virus, I just want to get the point that it's a lack of social and economic planning that is really impossible under capitalism. It's only under common ownership of the means of production where we can actually focus on long-term and short-term needs. So I would say that the coronavirus situation is part of a capitalist crisis that is much broader. But we can see the class essence, the political nature of the crisis in the way that society has responded, especially the state. I mean, especially in more than my lifetime. I've never seen anything like this in the 30 years that I've been alive, but it's highlighted the contradictions of capitalism in that time like nothing else I've ever seen, and perhaps I never will see. The delay for the lockdown, as the rest of Europe is on its knees, we're delaying lockdown, we're flirting with herd immunity. And people, the media reports that this is, it's the scientific community, the government is saying we're just listening to scientific community. But herd immunity, it's a value, it's not just a piece of science, it's a value of trying to allow the whole coronavirus to spread through the people, and then the businesses can continue to function. So I think the flirtation with herd immunity for a long time, I think it was 11 days at least, when they were seriously wondering whether to pursue this strategy. And I think we could argue that even now, it's a slow form of herd immunity. We're going to slowly let it go through the population in Britain and open up the economy and try to deal with that way, rather than eradicating the disease as we've seen in China especially. So any society that was really focusing on basic needs, that wasn't pursuing profit, they would have locked down immediately, and they wouldn't even, not even for a second, try to consider whether herd immunity was a possible option, and certainly, the people wouldn't allow them to, because ultimately the priority wouldn't be profit and all the rest of it. And this class nature has just been highlighted non-stop throughout the entire crisis. The way that we distinguish between a so-called essential worker and then a non-essential worker. I refer to this, the essential worker, as the working class. It's a byword for the working class. Non-essential workers, in other words, people who have money can simply retire to their houses, wait out the infection. But if you need to pay your bills, you can't simply withdraw to your house and not pay. So it's the most vulnerable people in Britain that have been forced to take the biggest risks to face this crisis, and it's been an absolute disgrace how they've been treated up until now. And I'll come on a bit more about that in a bit. But the coronavirus, as I say, it primarily affects working families. It's working families that simply can't afford to, they're subject to having to pay rents and all the rest of it. And so they don't really have any control in this kind of situation, whereas more wealthy people do. So it's a working class. It primarily affects the working class. But we've also got a government that has made it so much harder for working families across the country, because we've got a government that is essentially representing big business. We've got a conservative government that is in bed with big business, that believes in big business. Their favourite word is growth and deregulation. And so this was put, Britain in a very vulnerable situation. And we saw in the December election, one of the biggest disgraces of this entire escapade is how the Tories ran against the Labour Party in December, only a few months ago, really, on the basis that £70 billion of investment in the infrastructure of this country, primarily to help working people. They ran an election on the basis that it would bankrupt the country. They couldn't afford it. There was no magic money tree. And then within days of the coronavirus striking and spreading, the Tory announced a £350 billion bailout to bail out big businesses, to keep money circulating in the economy. After all the people that had needed a pay rise, after all the food banks and all the rest of it, it took them not so long in order to come to the rescue to help business, when really people have been needing a pay rise for a long time. And we also saw in other measures that the government took in terms of paying mortgages, or delaying mortgages rather, whereas people who had to pay rent, they were forced to pay rent. In other words, they were forced to work. They were forced to be the essential workers. And it's no surprise that the government would delay mortgages but not rent. And it's because the government are essentially in bed with the landlords, and they can control the banks. They have a lot of influence over the banks, the mortgages. So these kind of measures, key measures that the government have taken, just highlight the class nature of the entire crisis. There's been some businesses that have been making a killing, not just Amazon, but private healthcare corporations have been making an absolute killing throughout this crisis, been charging the NHS £300 a bed, and this doesn't include renting out their staff, nurses and doctors, for a price tag to the NHS, been renting buildings. And this is going to be a huge problem post-coronavirus, because now these private healthcare corporations become much more intertwined than ever before with government ministers, become much more intertwined than ever before with the NHS, because the NHS has been relying so fundamentally on private healthcare. And it's a battle, actually, that we've been losing in the past and during the health crisis. So I think this is going to be a key struggle going on, really trying to take on the private healthcare sector once and for all, because they're going to be much more competitive and much more influential post-coronavirus. The media, the mainstream media, have played a shocking role throughout the crisis, not asking tough questions, simply repeating what the Tory government has been saying. We're listening to the science. We're only doing what the science says. When what mainstream media should be doing is what the social media, like the Coronavirus Fight Back campaign is doing, and the People's Assembly is questioning the deception and the lies. So the media has to be understood really as being in bed with the government on this, and the medical officer, the chief medical and scientific officers. We've got to remember that they might carry the name of science and they might carry the name of medical officer, but they are appointed by a Tory government. And they're, from the get-go, they were appointed for a reason, most likely because they would hush up in a situation like such as this, or they were Tories anyway. And I think it's a bit in disgrace what the kind of role that they've been playing. They should be questioning the government much more than they have been. Another thing that's not going to go away, well, unless we fight for it, but one of the major issues is care homes and how some of our most vulnerable people in Britain were essentially depopulated from the NHS and forced into, I've called them before, concentration camps of coronavirus, because that is where the coronavirus is spread more than anywhere else. It's an absolute disgrace. Some of our most vulnerable people have been dying because of government political decisions to just throw people around like they're nothing, and to depopulate the NHS, throw them in care homes that were already reported. There were masses of reports already known that these private owners of care homes, and to call them care homes is really a contradiction in terms, they already knew that they were spreading with coronavirus already when they were depopulated. And some of the staff have been complaining. We've seen care staff being sacked for complaining about not enough PPE. We've seen care staff being told they have to turn up for work and be tested at work, even if they have a temperature. And this is part of the neglect over many years and decades, privatisation, lack of deregulation, the Tories being largely manipulated by the care staff. I mean, Boris had the mistake to criticise care homes recently, put all the blame on the care homes as if they could simply be separated, the Tory government and the care homes, and he paid the price for that. But he's changed his mind, and I'm sure they'll make friends again. Another way we saw the class nature of the situation is in the sense of businesses prioritising non-essential items. In Amazon, Jeff Bezos is now the wealthiest man of the world. He's made a killing out of the coronavirus. He increased his staff by 30,000 when the coronavirus struck. He was taking on the business, that when businesses closed, he was trying to take on the business that other business couldn't make because they had to shut down and take out bailouts. And so he was selling, him and Amazon was selling non-essential items like mouse pads and plant pots, as when they weren't supposed to, when they were told that this isn't happening. Construction, privileged construction sites in some of the wealthiest areas of Britain, like Kensington, still development, still taking place, clearly non-essential, that was being described as essential. And the Tories were clearly ambiguous in what they meant by essential and non-essential. In other words, leaving it to the employer to decide. They have their form of domination over the worker. They can make them go to work. And more recently, we've seen the reactivation, a real slap in the face, the reactivation of universal credit, for the sanctions for the universal credit. It was only weeks ago we were saluting and celebrating essential workers as the bread and butter of the heroes of the country. And now these same people who were celebrating have slapped on the sanctions for the most vulnerable people, trying to force them to do the essential jobs while the coronavirus is still killing hundreds of people almost every day. So it's not gone away. And as a comrade said earlier, it's what we're looking at now is herd immunity, but allowing it to slowly infect. So it's a balance between trying to cater to the big businesses, keep them open, while on the other hand, the strategy is to let it spread rather than go after and eradicate it. And in the past few days, we've also seen further bailouts from businesses. No pay rise for essential workers. Let's forget the essential workers. Yep, they were the heroes a few weeks ago, but they're not heroes any longer, the Boris Johnson and his buddies might say. It's been businesses in the past few days that have been bailed out. It's all about growth, about trying to do business, allow them to be the future and not put any money back into the purses of the people who need it. So one of the big things we really need to be doing, in my view, is fighting for these essential workers, highlighting that we shouldn't leave them behind, and that they were here for us. And we should emphasise it's the working class that have been, who have been abused during this whole thing, and we shouldn't let them get away with supporting business like they've already started to in the past few days. So some of the things perhaps that we need to follow, I like to, for us to discuss in the Q&A. We can all draw upon, ask each other questions. It could be some kind of forum where we can discuss a plan of action for now, how we try to move on from this and take the fight back to the Tories. But some ideas perhaps, is we need to start thinking about integrating services more and planning much more, which entails public ownership. As I was saying earlier, I think in order to have proper planning and focus on needs, we need to start to see that the wealth being taken away from the councils. And this will be crucial, because if the coronavirus comes back in, or I shouldn't be using that word, comes back, if we have a spike come the winter, these are arguments that could really make a huge difference. We need state direction of investment, and the sharing of the massive wealth in this country, because it's been the working class that have been made to pay, but there's more than enough wealth to go around. 80% of the wealth in this country is controlled by a small fraction of the population. So it's not the lack of wealth, comrades. I think we can really make some of these cases. I'd just like us to talk about things, act as a forum, and let's see what we can do together. Thank you for the time, comrades.
Sweden is held up as an example of a wonderfully controlled social democratic country, which has a welfare state which is an example to the world, blah, 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 that kind of thing. And yet it went for herd immunity, which seems to place it on the side of capitalism and getting the capitalist economy protected and on the move. So I'm puzzled by this, that a country which is supposed to be so advanced socially with a welfare state is doing this kind of thing. Can you help me understand what's going on there?
Just keep that question and maybe answer, if there are a couple of questions coming your way, maybe answer them a bit further down the line. So Tony's next, and then Bill has indicated to speak after Tony.
Can I thank Oliver for his excellent analysis based on class, which is probably one of the better ones I've heard over the last 2 weeks. I think Oliver's right to talk about defending public sector and claim and argue for integrated services. It's interesting that I think it was yesterday a Tory argued for care homes to be brought back into the public sector. Now, I'm not naive, and that's not because they think care homes should be in the public sector. What this is about is the fact that care homes are going to fail as a consequence of the health crisis. And therefore they see no other way of protecting that. But nevertheless, it is right for us to argue, I think, as Morning Star supporters, that we want integrated health and social care system. We also want that doesn't actually cream off lots of money to the private sector, either through the trade bill that's just going through the House of Commons now, which will open up the health sector to privatisation, or through organisations like Serco and others who have got their grubby little hands into track and trace. And there is now an alternative track and trace system being established by the government that's totally in private sector hands. And all this is about shoring up the private sector profits. It's not about public sector efficiency. If we'd about an integrated health and social care system, 25,000 people would not have been deported, if you like, from the NHS into the social care system, because that would have been joined up, would have been integrated. And I like Oliver, I think, Jim, and I'll finish on this point, because there's lots more that could be said, of course. actually believe the government has a herd immunity policy, which is not one based on everybody gets it at the same time, but one based on people get it gradually. And they're doing that quite deliberately because they were frightened of actually seeing loads of dead people on trolleys in our hospitals, because they saw that in Italy. And their aim, of course, through the Nightingale hospitals, etc., was to avoid that particular fear. They've come through that now. I don't believe there actually will be an antiviral that can actually work like a vaccine. I think what they're planning is actually amelioration, so that people, not as many people die because they're taking medicines that will actually cure them, and therefore they've come to an acceptable number of people that will die. And as Oliver said, and end on this point, that we mainly working class people. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you. So, Bill, to be followed by Andy, please.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question about how different governments have responded to the herd immunity notion, and the fact that they've now had to sort of hide Cummings in a cupboard somewhere where he pulls the strings from there. But yeah, if you look at when you look at the coronavirus fight back page, you see the cover picture is a still from the BBC News of May the 20th, which shows the spike at the beginning, which was predicted to have caused would have caused 250 to 500,000 deaths if it had been just take it on the chin, as Boris Johnson was saying at the time, and then that being replaced by a series of 4 peaks over a period of 12 months. The quantity of people is identical beneath the curve of the 4 peaks to what it would have been at the beginning, about 250 to 500,000 people. And of course, we're at 65,000 now, and this is still the first peak. So the ruthlessness of capitalism becomes apparent to people as well. And I think we have to make it apparent that this is, as Oliver said, there's a natural disaster. The way that it's handled by different societies gives a lot to be thought about, of course. I just wanted to say a word about the shutdown in Leicester, which is just down the road from where I am, really. We were talking with the Indian Workers Association last night about the sweatshops, which have been given a real boost by the coronavirus, because as businesses close down that operate within laws, the sweatshops that operate outside the law have continued to grow and provide the big brands with the clothes that they want to sell online. And of course, if you look around the world, the German meat factory, the Two Sisters chicken outfit, both in Derby and I think in Anglesey, in Eckington, and the Leicestershire, they all have it in common that these are super exploitative workplaces where people have very little control, very little in the way of health and safety, and for one reason or another, no trade union organisation, largely because they employ vulnerable migrant labour or people from ethnic minorities who have been subject to oppression for a long time. So when you hear the sort of bald statistic that working class people are twice as likely to die as people from another social class or whatever, it is reflected in the reality of those people's lives. And I think, again, people are beginning to see the iniquities of this. Now, how long we'll be able to maintain that and make sure that people are aware of it is another thing. The only other thing I wanted to mention was there's a People's Assembly meeting tonight going on at the moment about the arts and the bailout of the arts. Not enough money, too late, etc., the big story. But where it's going to is all into private sector entrepreneurs, because there is no state culture in Britain. But the build money, small as it is at the moment and being talked about a little bit at a time, is undoubtedly going to speed the process of privatisation. And I think we're going to have to watch out for this. It's going to be direct state public money being put into the private sector in order to rebuild the economy. That's how they'll present it. But obviously, you're going to have to make some kind of guarantees to people if they're going to get stuck into building new infrastructure and so on, about things like keeping pay down, making sure pensions are controlled for the sake of the employer, etc. So I think we're going to see the maintenance of all the anti-union legislation and anti-worker legislation with a great big handout, which will be to the employing class, which will be presented as the country re-establishing the economy. Those are just more points to add to what Oliver's been saying in a very good introduction. Thanks for organising the meeting too. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you for your contribution. So Andy's going to speak next, and just before he does, he's requested that I just share a very brief video with you all, which I received from Bill a couple of months ago. Something that puts some things into some sort of perspective. So, Andy, you want to share this video with us?
Well, the government's scientific advisors have warned that social distancing policies will need to be in place for the best part of a year, alternating between strict and less strict measures to help intensive care units cope.
The scientists are trying to prevent one huge peak of cases of COVID-19, which would overwhelm NHS intensive care units. Instead, there'd be a series of smaller peaks spread out throughout a year. To achieve this, they would suppress and then release the virus. Suppress and then release the virus by turning the social distancing measures on and off like a tap, on and off like a tap, to control the flow of patients into intensive care. They predict a 2 to 3 week delay between measures being put into place and their impact being felt in intensive care. The scientists estimate that 2% of those aged under 50 who get infected will need to be admitted to hospital, rising to 44% among the over 80s. The fatality rate for COVID-19 is very age dependent, varying from 0.01% or 1 in 10,000 among the under 20s, rising to 8% or 1 in 12 among the over 80s.
But it was made very clear by the video we just saw that the strategic objective of the government is to allow the virus to affect everyone in the country, but just control the rate in which they get infected to not effectively blow the public relations exercise of not being thrown out of government. Right from the very beginning, China, just to offer some context, China discovered the virus, or tracked it and identified it on December the 29th, 2019. It took them about 2 weeks to get their head properly round it. They sequenced the genome by the 12th of January. They concluded by the 19th of January it was definitely human-to-human transmission. And they closed down Wuhan on the 23rd of January, a city of 11 million people. The following day, they closed down Hubei, a province of 60 million people, the size of Britain. And then effectively they closed down the entire country and all their manufacturing base to tackle this issue. So the question is, why did they do that? What was their objective? Why did they take such dramatic action? And they took it because they calculated that the cost of not taking it would be millions dead in China, and that was an unacceptable cost. And they concluded that this virus was new to the human species as of December 2019, and therefore the strategic objective in relation to the virus was to remove it from the human species. It had just come in, let's get rid of it while we can. That's why they took such dramatic action. They had 542 confirmed cases on the 23rd of January when they closed down their country. Right? And they took that dramatic action because they wanted to eliminate the virus from the human species. All the they work closely with the World Health Organization, and every single scientific organization across the whole world had access to all this information in real time. So every scientist knew what everybody else knew. And I think we're going to need a public inquiry after, well, not after all this is over, because this is not going away, not for a generation. But we need a public inquiry, possibly starting next year, as far as I'm concerned, under the auspices of the World Health Organization, where every single decision that the government's made of each countries in the world from the middle of January onwards should be scrutinised and analysed for what decisions they took. Because it is clear to me, by the actions they have taken, that they got a briefing from the scientific community in the middle towards the end of January, and they took a decision at that moment. They took a decision that it would be too expensive for capitalism to resolve this crisis. Because it wasn't a 60% death rate of the Black Death, it was 2% as far as you could best calculate at the time that they made that decision. They thought to themselves, 2% dead, capitalism could survive that. And therefore, every decision they took since then has been to achieve their strategic objective. So they haven't made mistakes, they haven't done missteps, they weren't clumsy or ignorant. It was deliberate and strategic once they'd accepted as their baseline opinion that they would not stop the spread of the virus. Once they took that decision, every other decision they have taken can be judged in that context. And it's clear to me that neither the Labour Party nor the trade union movement have properly understood that that was the strategic objective of the government. There's the fundamental question of what is the strategy regarding the virus has never been asked by anyone, as far as I'm aware. The question has never been asked. What is your strategy regarding the virus? There's been questions on every other element: PPEs, beds, wards, ventilators. There's been dozens and millions of questions on every one of them, but no question ever by anybody on what is the strategy regarding the virus, because only the answer to that question can make sense of decisions they've taken before. So they've taken the decision to allow the virus to spread, but for public relations reason, they've got to control the rate in which it spreads. Herd immunity is illogical. If herd immunity can exist in relation to this virus, which is another question altogether, but herd immunity is the end product of not finding a vaccine. If a vaccine's found, we'll have it, and hopefully that short circuits everything. In the absence of that, and news is looking quite good on the vaccine, by the way, as far as I'm aware, but in the absence of that, capitalism will chug along happily with this crisis. But what this crisis is showing is the contradictions of capitalism are coming to a head dramatically, and this has put them on steroids. But I think the Labour movement has got to decide, well, the reality is what the decisions that the government have made means that every single individual human being in Britain has to make a personal decision about what they're going to do in relation to their risk factors and this virus. Because this virus, under the government strategy, is going to be in Britain for the rest of our lives, unless the vaccine's found, because their objective is not to eliminate it. So if you don't feel safe now, you won't feel safe in 5 years' time, right? Because it ain't going away. That's the crime of what this government has done. And that's the things. Now, in relation to the scientific community, I think the scientific community is going to have some kind of reckoning on this, because they've allowed themselves to be used by government spin doctors way too much. I know Dr. Fauci in America argued 3 months ago that masks, the public wearing of masks is no good. Well, now he's admitted he was lying then because they didn't have enough masks. Which shows a fundamental mistrust of your own population, because I'm absolutely certain if you'd have said to the population, of course masks make sense, but we ain't got enough at the moment, so let the hospital workers have them, that would have been easily manageable. But once you adopt a societal standard of every man for themselves, then then inevitably you had to lie to the population as far as their logic is concerned. And whenever the government is saying they're following the best scientific advice, to be fair, they are, right? And the scientists are giving the best scientific answers. The question is, what was the question posed to the scientists? If the question was posed to the scientists, how do we eliminate the virus from the island of Britain? Scientists would have given an answer on how to achieve that. But that wasn't the question that the scientists were asked. The scientists were asked, how can we keep the infection level in such a way that we don't run over capacity? And the scientists have advised the government how to achieve that. And the government implemented it, and it worked. So the scientific advice, but as one director of public health, former director of public health, I heard on an interview a couple of weeks ago, he was describing that the scientific community around the government are not allowed without government ministers' permission to speak and give their scientific advice just in interviews. And this former director was pointing out that when he was a scientific advisor, he insisted that he had to go on television interviews and just give his science regardless of the policy implications. But that has been changed.
Andy, finish up now.
Yeah, and just the only other thing is the racial implications of this coronavirus and the deaths is enormous. 6 times higher death rate, I think, for black and other ethnic minorities. Male over female deaths is significant, and obviously it's all underpinned by the class nature because it's mostly working class people. So, in the Nightingale hospitals, I was an intensive care staff nurse for 6 years. Those Nightingale hospitals, which were in case out of overcapacity, to consider those anywhere close to an intensive care unit is to consider attending my garden hospital.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you. Okay, anybody else? I haven't seen anyone else indicate. Oliver, you've had one, maybe a couple of questions that you might want to come back on. So unless anyone indicates now, Tony wants to come in. Oliver, do you want to deal with a couple of points or a couple of questions that you've been asked?
Well, there was really,
and then I'll bring Tony in afterwards.
Yeah, is it Pam? I think Pam's question regarding.
Yes, about Sweden.
Yeah, Sweden. I think that was really the question. I mean, I'm not an expert on Sweden. I'm more looking at South America. But the basic that I do know is that in Sweden, it's described as social democratic. What I've read is it's better described as corporatist because there's a strong relationship between the business community and the trade union movement in Sweden. So I mean, it's not the same as Britain, where we've got more of an independent trade union movement. So perhaps they could have done some kind of arrangement, some kind of negotiation. It's very much corporativist, in my view, anyway, of Sweden.
I see. Yeah.
So that could be one explanation why they've been happy to take this approach. I mean, I can speak about Colombia as a different country, just as they've been nowhere near as damaged as we have in Britain, but they've been closing down the borders much. They've shut down their border entirely until the 31st of August. We didn't do that ever. I mean, literally, you can still take flights out and take flights in throughout the entire crisis in Britain. All you need to do is say to yourself, it's essential. You tell them it's essential, and it's essential. And obviously we saw Cuba. I was absolutely shocked about how Cuba dealt with it, because we know that Cuba's economy depends massively on tourism. So I was very concerned about how they would manage the situation. But they shut down their tourist industry. So not to mention all the support that they gave to other countries. So that's all I can really offer on the.
That's fine. Thank you very much. I know Sweden subsequently have had lots of deaths, haven't they? They haven't had it easy. They've had a lot of deaths as a result of herd immunity that they've gone for. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I'll bring Tony in, and then Bill's indicated. So Bill after Tony.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on 2 of the points that perhaps need to be developed. One is, I think we do need to criticise directly the so-called Chancellor's aid package that came out yesterday. It is not designed to safeguard or create jobs. If it had done so, it would have invested money or bought shares or partial ownership in the motor manufacturing and aerospace industries in the Midlands. What it's done is actually created a pool of cheap labour that companies can rely on for 6 months. And after 6 months, if they're not good enough, they'll be sacked. And as a trade unionist, that is the worst sort of employment that I would want coming into organised workplaces. Indeed, as Pam was touching on before, if it was any good, then John Lewis and Boots would have actually taken the opportunity to use it rather than closing jobs, closing workplaces this morning. The second thing I think is the question of diversion, which capitalist organised countries, nations always do. We're seeing a massive attack on China at the moment in the capitalist press and in capitalist countries, from blaming them for the actual virus coming out of their own country, not actually blaming them for health measures or blaming them for the laboratories, although there's evidence now to suggest that COVID-19 existed way before it was actually identified as a health threat in China. But secondly, they're also making up stories relating to things that are going on in China. There's no way, by the way, that this government would take 3.5 million people, which I think, if my memory serves right, it's half the population of Hong Kong, into this country and give them jobs and feed them and whatever. And that's ratcheting up that. And we've seen the increased trade war on China as well. That is a diversion. And if anybody's read any history, which I'm sure most colleagues have, most comrades have, you will know that the build-up to the First World War, right, was designed deliberately to start actually having a go at certain countries. In Britain's case and France's case, it was Germany. And I think there's very worrying tendencies there. It doesn't mean there's going to be a war, Jim, but it does mean there's diversion here. So I think we've got to recognise, as other comrades have already, international dimensions of this. But I just want to pick on that particular area in terms of the Chancellor's thing, which I think we need to attack, and also the international issues as well.
Thank you, comrade. Bill, and then Geraldine.
Okay, I'll try and be quick. I think the question of how the state's reacted to people in their situation they find themselves. For example, in Melbourne, where they have sealed off a number of tower blocks with 3,000 people in it, and just denied them without any notice at all the right to leave the building. Working class quarter of Melbourne, obviously, and beating people who try to leave the flats. In Germany, where they put a huge metal fence around the housing blocks that house the East European workers at the meat production factory. And of course, it coincides with the BLM protests and the degree of ferocity that people have been met with there. So the state itself, I think, feels that it is under threat because the situation is becoming, it's not a normal situation, and people are beginning to protest about the fact that of the class nature of it. So that's one thing. But I do think we need to shift the emphasis now. We need to keep up all the warnings about the second spike and the need for safe workplaces, etc. But I think we have to really be sure that what we're doing is alerting people to what's going to follow this. CLASS, the Centre for Labour and Social Studies, estimates 6 million jobs will go in Britain, 60 million across Europe. There's a huge, already there's 60,000 jobs have been done in the last few days, in the last week, have been announced, 60,000 job loss, and that is just the beginning. And we have to track this because unemployment will be used as the regulator, again, both of wages and conditions, but also to keep people in their place. If you don't want the job, there'll be plenty who do. And I think we have to, as socialists, recognise the fact that things have a life and there's a momentum to it. And it's what comes next that we ought to be laying the ground for now. And that is not just opposing unemployment, but saying what we need. We need diversification of industry. We need new green jobs. We need all the things that are already in the trade union movement, and that we've passed for years in TUC policy and never done anything about. And this is a great opportunity as well as a great tragedy for the left now to say we know where Britain needs to go next.
Mm.
Thank you. Leon's indicated that he'd like to make a contribution. So, Leon?
Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, just a couple of quick points really. I mean, one is how we build alliances with some of the sectors of society that are going to be worst impacted by this. I'm thinking specifically of like the self-employed that have been left behind with the furlough schemes and with grants, etc., that aren't traditionally part of any trade union movement or working class movement. How do we build alliances with these people to actually, show them the injustice of what's been happening and point them in the right direction, so to speak? Also seeing already increased number of people on the streets, homelessness. I think what we're going to find, particularly now, the evictions will start again, particularly in the rented sector of society. We're going to see a mass housing crisis, and again, how do we cope with that? What do we do? What strategy? Because unfortunately, I don't see much leadership from the Labour Party. That's my contribution. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Leon. I think extremely valuable contribution there, posing some extremely important questions. So I'll open that up for discussion. Doesn't need to just go on to Oliver in terms of across all of you. Geraldine, are you indicating? Yep, Geraldine's going to speak. Go on, Geraldine.
When I put my thumbs up before, that was supporting what Tony was saying, and Leon also is making the same point. We can't rely on parliamentary democracies to put people first. We put the capitalist economy first, and Tony and Leon were spelling out the sort of issues we're going to have to fight on and not expect Parliament or anyone else to keep fighting our corner. It's up to us.
Yeah. Thank you. Anybody else? Any other comrades want to come in? Tony's just put something into the chat there, so people might want to have a look at that.
Yeah.
I mean, the other element of this crisis, I think I'd made a comment to Jim privately a couple of months, 3 months ago. I don't know. Sort of time gets distorted in this world, but very early on, I said, possibly in a little extreme, but socialism or fascism will arise out of this crisis, because capitalism. I mean, this isn't doing anything fundamental, but it is accelerating the contradictions of capitalism, and it's accelerating in dramatic form the destruction of the middle class, private restaurants, and just alongside the normal reduction in the middle class and the pressure on the middle class, as Mark said, the middle class will go into the working class ultimately at the end of it's the ultimate contradictions of capitalism play out. And so I presume there's going to be some kind of financial crisis. I presume there's going to be some kind of housing crisis. There's definitely going to be an unemployment crisis. I think we're going up to 4 or 5 million once October's out of the way, because both my kids are furloughed now. My eldest is back at work, but my youngest is still furloughed. That's all going to stop at the end of October, and companies ain't going to keep them on. And this is going to be magnified on an enormous scale. And we won't go into 2021 with people thinking the government are tackling the virus. I don't know how long they can be conned into thinking the government is tackling the virus, but it can't last forever because they're not. And so the issues that will arise over the coming months and year or two will appear paradoxical in parts, and we'll be finding alliances with bedfellows that you wouldn't have thought was possible. I think.
Thanks, Andy. Anybody else? Anyone want to sketch out what needs to be our strategy going forward?
Moz.
Tony's just popped that up.
Moz is.
Moz is indicating. Sorry, Moz, I didn't see you there. Please come in.
Apologies, I missed the introduction. But I just wanted to make a couple of points. I was at a meeting a couple of days ago of the Midlands TUC executive, and the reports that we are getting there of the attacks that are taking place on workers, irrespective of whether or not they've been furloughed. We've got examples of the Leicester care workers employed who have received dismissal notices from their employer, who could be re-engaged by the very same employer. These are those local authority homes contracted out that have been doing all the caring of those older people that have been discharged from hospital with the virus without their knowledge. So in Leicester, they dismissed them. Some of them will be re-engaged, but on worse terms and conditions. You've got examples like Tower Hamlets local authority, which has just decided it will reduce all its terms and conditions of employees. And I think we are only at the start of seeing the attack that is going to take place on public services and unions. And the point I was making is I get report after report after report from the TUC that talks about the increase in union membership, and just about every union is reporting the increase in membership. And one of the points I was making was, it's not a lot of good when someone receives a dismissal notice because they've said they won't accept a reduction in their terms and conditions, unnegotiated reductions, if the only thing that happens is they are offered legal advice from their union. That membership in the trade union that has increased can also disappear overnight, because the reason you join a union is to be collective, to be strong, and that isn't just about getting legal advice on your dismissal notice. So I think we've really got to use the situation we're in now to build from the bottom up. So in the Midlands TUC, I was asking which unions are organising branch member meetings on Zoom. Never mind about all the elected officers or the executive being able to meet together. Which unions are using the new facilities to have branch meetings, to reach out to their members? Because most of the experience that I've seen is Zoom meetings are attracting more people than a physical meeting does. That's actually been the case, the Midlands TUC. There are more people online because the Midlands area is a flipping big area, let's be honest. And if you've got 2.5 hours to travel for a 2-hour meeting, 2.5 hours there, the 2-hour meeting and 2.5 hours back, you know, not everyone who should be there is there, but they're on the Zoom meetings. So I think there is opportunities for us within this drastic situation to start organising better and to develop the union strength in our communities and in our workplaces. And I think trade union councils have a key role to play in that, the unions in the community, because unless we build that bottom-up approach, this system is going to try and take us out in order to survive itself. That's all I want to say.
Yeah, just mentioning Leicester just reminded me of an interview I saw yesterday. A very brave worker in one of these sweatshops that was mentioned earlier on £3 an hour, and giving an interview about the conditions in those sweatshops in Leicester. And at the time when he was giving the interview, a car drove by with one of the owners of one of these factories which abusing this guy. how again do we make sure we protect these workers that are standing up and actually telling us what's happening? Protect them from these bosses and the henchmen they have with them as well. It's, if we've got to somehow protect these guys that are putting their own sort of safety on the line. And I'm not sure exactly, again, how we do that.
Thank you, Leon. Quick point from Tony.
I'm going to say 3 words really: educate, agitate, organise. We first of all have to educate people what's going on. We then have to agitate amongst those people to get them to do something, and then we have to say we're now going to organise to do that. It's what we've done time and time again when we've been successful. If we jump one of those things, Jim, then we won't be successful. We'll go straight to organisation. We won't have educated people or agitated to get enough people involved. Finished.
Perhaps, Oliver, you could just briefly sum up what you think of the discussion we've had and any points that have been raised.
No, just where to go from here. Obviously, as Tony said, educate, agitate, organise is a really good way of summing up what we need to be doing. The class nature of Britain has been revealed so blatantly that we've got a lot of ammunition really to highlight this, and it doesn't stop, and it won't stop for the foreseeable future. They will continue to make workers pay, and I think that's what we've all really been highlighting today, is that it's the working class and working families that have been are going to have to pay for this crisis, and they'll try to dress it up. The Tories will try to dress it up in all kinds of words, all kinds of spin, and it's our job to really highlight the falsity of this, of them trying to essentially protect the capitalist class, only focusing on growth and business. And it's our job really to fight against their lies and their spin. The forms that we can do is, I'm just as much learning from other people here as anyone is from me. Social media has a big role to play, I believe, as Moz was saying, about many people getting involved online. It can't just be online, obviously, but if it's a way to try and reach more people, I think social media is a really important tool of doing that. The People's Assembly is picking up at the moment, which is great to see. And also the NHS, it's been mentioned before to me, the possibility of using a kind of forum through the NHS, because they played such a decisive role. I think the NHS is really a good, an important battleground, not only because the private companies will try to take on the NHS increasingly in the future, because as I was suggesting, they've done really well out of this crisis. So I think that's a centre of gravity at the moment, taking on the private corporations that are invested in healthcare. That's just, some few comments, and cheers.
Thank you, Oliver. Sorry, I was just struggling with my mute button there. Thank you, and thank you for coming to address our public meeting. We do appreciate that this evening, and thank you to everyone who's turned out. I did receive a number of apologies before the meeting, and a couple have come in during as well. So we might have hoped for a few more people, but I think comrades will agree on the quality of the lead off from Oliver and the way that provoked, I think, a really good high level of discussion. And hopefully people can go away with the idea that we're not powerless, but actually we have no choice other than to organise, educate ourselves and agitate amongst our work colleagues and our friends and our family in terms of forging a fight back against the onslaught that we're facing. And I think Moz, absolutely, trades councils have to be that tribune of the union movement that can bring people together. And I'm hopeful as well that the People's Assembly will push forward and also become a beacon of hope and an arena for organising those who are perhaps a bit demoralised with the lack of a response from the leadership of the mass party of the class, that being the Labour Party in particular, who seem to be very coalescent, as far as I can see, going along with supporting the government strategy at a time when they think it's unfashionable to be critical and we have to show a united face and this, that and the other. Seems a very peculiar agenda to me. I think that it's crying out for some truths to come out amidst this chaos, and really the government needs to be fully held to account, and that's what you would least expect from an opposition.